When was the last time someone startled you? Or do you have a particularly memorable time when someone made you jump? A clear memory from when I was a kid, blue and dark gray are the colors of this memory. We had gathered in our darkest clothes to play flashlight tag in the dark. I was 6th or 7th grade or so. We'd met in my friend's backyard, central location. He had excellent terrain for this kind of thing. Sloping backyard, lots of trees, property with plenty of hiding spaces. The three-quarter moon overhead gave enough light to make things just a little bit eerie. Of course, the crickets accompanied us with their nightly song. According to our rules, whoever was it would have to find one of the hiders, shine the light on them, and call their name out loud to be able to tag them. And they'd have to go to the waiting spot until there was only one person who had not been found. That person would be the next it. Now, I was particularly good at this game, and I'd been the last one to be found in the previous round. Hiding in the dark is a particular talent of mine. So it was my turn to be it. To catch people effectively in flashlight tag, you want to sneak through the shadows yourself, right? If you're going to find someone and call their name, it's best to get as close as you can and surprise them. But this time, my friends seemed to be hiding exceptionally well. I couldn't find any of them. And after 10 minutes of looking, it was a big yard, but it wasn't that big. Based on the occasional rustle or muffled snort, I started to think that they were moving around when my back was turned. There was a tree on the west end of the house. I decided to go there and check the branches again, but as I made my stealthy way toward the trunk, I heard something behind me. Whipped around, turned the knob on my mag light, and nearly jumped clean out of my dark gray flashlight tag clothes. All three of my buddies were right there, pressed side by side against the brick next to the chimney, grinning like idiots. It took me a few minutes to slow my heart rate, but that's part of the fun of flashlight tag, right? Being startled at night isn't always so lighthearted. Our brains are hardwired to be extra vigilant in the dark. The Lord knew for most of human history the dark would hold real dangers. We don't see as well as animals, and just how dangerous the thing that is out there making noise might be hard to tell, so the same part of my brain that made me jump during flashlight tag was also, or I should say, originally intended to protect me from things like leopards following me through the jungle or wherever. We're back in the story of Gideon. His tale has begun in the previous chapter, Judges 6. The Lord has come to Gideon as the man is in hiding. He tells him that he, Gideon, was the one to rescue Israel, and that Gideon should start by tearing down his own family's shrine to Baal and Asherah. Once that's done, Gideon requests more evidence that the Lord is truly the one talking to him. Now, the Lord had already given him a miraculous sign, but Gideon asks for something more in a way that looks a lot like divination. Remember this, it's important. He leaves a fleece out on the grass overnight and asks the Lord first that the fleece be wet and the grass dry. And when the Lord does so, Gideon realizes that's awfully close to what normally happens. Wool or whatever fabric will keep the dew from collecting on whatever is under it. So he asks again, this time for the opposite, a dry fleece and a wet ground. And the Lord humors him once again. Now, Gideon's assembled an army, and it starts out outnumbered something like 4-1. God tells him to cut back, and he gives instructions on how to cut even more, to where Gideon is left with 300 men. Now, instead of 4-1, they're outnumbered 450-1. 300 men against 135,000 of the enemy, Midianites. Sometimes when people unpack this story, you hear that the 300 were elite people, more alert than the others, originally called up, more vigilant, more courageous. We're tempted to think of them as elite fighters. I remember back during Desert Storm in 1991, a tiny group of Navy SEALs used explosives and machine gun fire to fool Saddam Hussein's forces into thinking they were being invaded from the sea instead of the land. What we're about to see in the story here does involve clever trickery in the dark, but Gideon's men are the opposite of special forces. They're volunteers, peasants, ordinary men who have left their families to come fight at the Lord's invitation. Not even at the 1 weekend a month level of the National Guard. And I'm not putting down the National Guard to say that, just comparing training levels. The point of Gideon's 300 is not God choosing the 300 best swordsmen or spear handlers or stone slingers. The point is that if 300 ordinary dudes like you and me defeat 6 divisions of enemy troops, it wasn't the ordinary guys that did it. It was the Lord. And this too is important to remember this as well. We're going to pick up the story. All this is background. We're picking up the story in Judges chapter 7, the middle of verse 8. Now I've got the Bible on my screen here. You can follow along in your paper Bible or on your phone. Here it is. Middle of verse 8, Judges 7. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they're saying. Afterward you'll be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. So there it is. Can you imagine the scene? Adrenaline beating through your veins as you're sneaking across the blue-gray hill in the starlight, smelling the smoke of enemy campfires, the stink of camels, the body odor of 135,000 people. The story doesn't mention the Midianites' sentries. Maybe by this time they were so used to crushing Israel that they didn't bother with a guard. But Gideon and Purah get close enough to the tents to overhear the conversation between a couple of guys among the enemy. Gideon arrived just as the man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force the tent overturned and was collapsed." Well, that's kind of weird. Barley is a typical cheap, low-quality food. The loaves were about the size of a large biscuit. The tents were probably bigger than a pup tent. They could serve as significant shelter, just like in the time of Abraham, if you imagine Abraham's tents. So the dream is kind of ridiculous. A modern version of this dream might be seeing a Pop-Tart or a package of ramen noodles flying through the air and blowing up an Abrams tank. A weird mental picture. "In my dream, a loaf of barley bread collapsed a tent." And his friend responds, "This can be no other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." In a way, the interpretation sort of makes sense. The Israelites were starving because these guys had taken all their food. If they had anything left, it was the cheap, cruddy food. But it was not all obvious. This meaning is not at all obvious if all you saw was a loaf of bread knocking down a tent. Maybe you remember how Gideon characterized himself at the beginning of the story. If not, it was something like, "I'm the youngest guy in the weakest clan of my tribe." It's a conversation he was having with the Lord. But here, God has sent him down into the valley. How did these Midianites even know his name? I mean, it's hard to hide the thousands of men who originally came to Gideon, so they may have known something else, but it's almost as though the guy interpreting the dream is having words come out of his mouth that he is not in control of. And Gideon and Purah had to sneak up at exactly that moment, at that spot in the valley, to hear this conversation out of all the whispered discussions in a camp of many thousands. I went exactly one time to the Pathfinder camporee in Wisconsin. If you're not familiar with Pathfinders, it's a religious co-ed scouting. And the Wisconsin event is a worldwide campout that happens every 5 years. The year I went, there were 50,000 people there. And there's no way you or I could have gone to the other side of the camp and heard someone talking about us, much less someone having had a dream about us. We're not famous. Gideon wasn't famous. Here in the dark, at the outskirts of the camp, Gideon and his servant are listening to this conversation, and the hair stands up on the back of their necks. This is creepy. Gideon had heard a voice in his mind, the voice of the Lord, telling him to go down here, but then this verbal, direct, live person, human voice saying the exact thing the Lord has been trying to get across to Gideon since the last chapter. And Gideon isn't hallucinating. That's why God told him to bring a trustworthy servant, so that he would not be able to tell himself that he only imagined this. This can be none other than Gideon ben Joash. God has given our camp to him to smash. Our hero has to be trembling all over. The next verse says, when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Thinking perhaps God really has chosen me. He's even told the enemy. The next part reads like Gideon is being carried along by the Holy Spirit. The way that he fights this battle seems like the way that God would do it. No indication of careful consideration or planning, though that could be the case. And instead of a clever tactic for swords and spears, that we find this. Verse 16. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, Gideon placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The ancients used clay pots for everything, for storage, sinks, shipping containers. We have pieces of them all over the place. That's how archaeologists date the sites where they're digging. They got these clay pots. The torches, flammable enough to keep smoldering in the pots, they would burst into fire when exposed to oxygen. And the trumpets, of course, were not metal, but a ram's horn, a shofar. The nice ones really do sound something like modern trumpets, but the ram's horns blown by ordinary guys sound scary. I have one I got off of Amazon. My kid told me it sounded like a broken goose. So this is what happens. Chapter 7, verse 19. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. That's roughly midnight. Just after the Midianites had changed the guard, they blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. You get 300 of those shofars blowing at once, and it sounds horrible. Just after midnight, echoing across the valley, this blast of noise, grating and long, had the effect of rousing the bleary-eyed Midianites. And as the enemy pushed out of their tents, they heard the sound of smashing pottery. The hills are all alive with torches. What would you do? Verse 20 continues, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding the right hands the trumpets they were to blow, the Israelites shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Bethshittah, down to Zerera, as far as the border of Abel Maholah near Tabbath. The Midianites ran. As they were following each other through the valley, some of them came to believe the troops following hard on their heels were not more of their comrades, but soldiers of their enemies, the Israelites. So they turned to fight, killed each other. That was the victory. Gideon's story continues all the way into the next chapter, but this is a good place to pause for now. A couple of things. Think about the sign that Gideon asked for with the fleece. We looked at it in detail last time, reviewed today. Wet and dry. Then consider the sign that God gave him through the Midianite fellow's dream that he snuck down to hear. Which of those communiques was more obviously divine? I mean, the Bible tells us God answered Gideon with that darn fleece, but that's like one step removed from studying the intestines of the sheep like so many ancient cultures did, right? But when God initiates, when God offers this man a sign on his own at the last minute to reassure Gideon, God shows that it's him speaking by lining up the moment of the conversation, the spot in the valley where the conversation happens, and somehow gives the interpreter of the dream Gideon's name and says God has given Gideon the victory. Which way of communicating do you think that God prefers? I believe it's possible to have a conversational relationship with God. That's how God wants to talk to us. Why don't most of us seem to hear him? Some of it is we don't believe it's possible, that God doesn't speak that way anymore. On a dark note, it could be that God has already spoken to us and we've disregarded what he said. This might be direct communication, or perhaps something that we have found in the Bible that we might not like. We might have been called by God to change in ways that we don't want to change. Why would God speak to us beyond that if we're already disregarding what he said before? Some of us would like a conversational relationship with the Lord, but we wonder how in the world we would be able to tell the difference between God's voice and our own thoughts. That's pretty clearly what God is doing with Gideon here in the story. He appears to him, talks to him face to face with the angel in chapter 6, and does a miracle there, sets the sacrifice on fire. And he doesn't seem to mind the fleece, and here in chapter 7, he goes beyond the fleece to show Gideon just how much he's able to speak to us simply by arranging reality around us as needed. So God is communicating with Gideon in different ways, but several times it just says that the Lord spoke to Gideon. The book of Hebrews tells us that anyone who comes to God, this is Hebrews 11 verse 6, anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Usually when we pray, the thing that we're asking for is a need of some kind for ourselves or others. But what we need most, of course, is God himself. And if he's going to reward those who earnestly seek him for himself, maybe one of those things that he offers is a back and forth conversational relationship. If a conversational relationship with God is something you want, I would invite you to try it out. As I've mentioned before, this is a prayer that I invite people to pray along these lines. Lord, I need to know what you want me to do. I'm listening. Please speak to me through your word, the people near me, the other things I read, and through things that happen in my life. Regular time in the Bible is key. Regular time with other followers of Jesus can help with this. These are ways we calibrate what we're experiencing. Just this week I saw on an internet forum someone talking about how they felt God approved of a relationship they wanted to pursue, but the fellow users rather emphatically pointed out that the person the original poster was not what the original poster was pursuing was not a believer. So the thing that was guiding them towards the relationship was not God, but their own desires. They were mistaking their own desires for God's voice. That is a real problem. That's why we have the scriptures. That's why we have communities to interpret these experiences and to interpret the Bible as well. So I guess one of the things that I have really been hit by here in the story of Gideon is that it's okay, even invited by God, to check and recheck what we believe that we are hearing from God. Gideon didn't have the benefit of the scriptures. Most of the nation had lost sight of God. And so maybe God took extra measures with Gideon to get through to him. But the checking and rechecking to be guided by God is, I think, a good thing. The other item to consider as we're wrapping up here, one of the most obvious things in the Gideon story, is that God is the one who does the work. God is not opposed to effort. I think we're supposed to put in our part, but it's God who actually gets the job done. Gideon was on scene, Gideon was following directions, but 300 farmers are not enough to defeat division after division of camel warriors. As the song goes, the battle belongs to the Lord. This is for you and for all of us. It works at the level of problem solving. You have a role to play, but the outcome is on God. It works at the level of overcoming sin. By all means, strive against it, but recognize that your strength is not what beats bad habits. or bad things that we do. Sometimes I think maybe God leaves us in those things until we recognize that it's His strength that will get us out of it. This battle belongs to the Lord, works at the level of the church as well. We might look at what we see around us, God's people corrupted by politics, lukewarm in its passion for God, compromised in lots of different ways, morally, doctrinally. We might be really discouraged by that. We might be discouraged by population growth, outpacing the spread of the gospel, the good news about Jesus. How can a feeble church carry out the commission that God has given to it? But God doesn't need a perfect church to get the gospel to the world. He just needs someone or two someones who are listening to Him and willing to go out there. The rest of humanity may never know those people's names, but that's okay. So today, are you listening to Him? Am I listening to Him? Are we willing? God is the master of reality. He holds the world in His hands, and in Him we live and move and have our being. It's no wonder the winning isn't on us. The victory belongs to God. I'll close with these two verses from Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Therefore, dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose. And this from 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. God bless you.